Hi, it's Tino here. If you like aggressive openings, you're in the right place. And today I'd like to look at the second of a two-part series in the Staunton Gambit against the Dutch defense. So after the moves pawn to d4, pawn to f5, the Dutch e4 introduces the Staunton Gambit, and black would usually have to play pawn takes e4 because he doesn't have better alternatives. And after knight to c3, and threatening to recapture the pawn, knight to f6 defending the pawn, bishop to g5 threatening to capture the knight first on f6 before recapturing on e4. In this second series, second of the two-part series, knight to c6, we're looking at knight to c6, the main line. Okay, white would usually play pawn to d5, and the point is that if the knight goes back, it would be a loss of tempo for black. So black would usually play knight to e5, and in this key position, queen to d4 is one of the popular tries, but black seems to be scoring decently in recent games. So a lot of white players are now playing this move, queen to e2, which is also my preference. Now the point of this move is white's ready to castle queenside almost straight away, and to start an attack against black's weakened kingside. Okay, so in this position, black has got two main options. So pawn to c6 is one, and knight to f7. So if we look at pawn to c6 first, my preference in this position is to play pawn to f4 because it's very direct. So after this move, pawn to f4, black would usually continue knight to f7. Just taking that back, the reason for this is pawn takes pawn en passant would be met by knight takes f3 when white would retain an advantage. Yeah, so after this move pawn to e4 and f4, sorry, and black would be forced to play something like knight to f7. But now white just simply plays bishop takes f6, and after say something like g takes f6, queen takes e4, we see white has a much better position. White's castle queen side already, and is ready to, attack on the king side. Note that in this position, black can't even go castle's king side because bishop d3 would be winning already. White can't, and black can't do anything to stop this, queen check on h7. So going back to position after queen to e2, we see the knight to pawn to c6 isn't very good because of pawn to f4. So in this position, in the main line, black would usually go knight to f7. But now white just simply captures on f6 first. Black can either go pawn e takes f6 or g takes f6. G takes f6 would lead us to a similar position as the one we just looked at in the previous variation after c6 and castles and queen side. So that'd be very similar positions. So just going back, so rather than play g takes f6, e takes f6 is the main line, and now knight takes e4. Now the black has to be careful here because a discover check with knight to d6 or knight to f6 is already on the cards. So there are a few tries for black here. Queen to e7 is the main line, but let's look at some alternatives. Bishop e7, but this allows this positional pawn sacrifice with pawn to d6 check. The point being that after pawn takes d6 and castles queen side, this extra pawn doesn't count for much because it's doubled and it's quite weak. Black's also going to have a bit of trouble developing the pieces on the queen side, so white's going to retain a long-term positional advantage. So yeah, just going back into this position, so sometimes black players play this bishop to b4 check first just to try and weaken the king side before going bishop to e7, but it doesn't really help black too much because white still retains a longer term, advantage in this position despite being a pawn down. Okay, so going back to that position after knight takes e4, and we see bishop to e7, bishop to b4, a little bit positionally suspect. So queen to e7 is the main line, but then again, white has this move pawn to d6. Now black has two options here, and queen to e6 being one of them, or knight takes d6. Let's look at queen to e6. Now the problem with queen to e6 is white can simply continue pawn takes c7, and after something like bishop b4 check to try and weaken the queen side, we see this a lot from black. Pawn to c3, bishop to a5, but then knight to c5, and after something like queen takes e2 check, bishop takes e2, bishop takes c7, white would simply play knight to f3, and yeah, already we see that after both sides castle, white has a more pleasant position, so the two rooks can end up on the d and e files. So all in all, a much better position for white. So going back to the main line, after knight takes e4, queen to e7 and d6, black would usually go knight takes d6, knight takes d6 check. Now obviously the pawn has to castle and capture on d6 because queen takes d6 is impossible because of this pin. After pawn takes d6 and castles queen side, black's pretty much forced to play queen takes e2, bishop takes e2, and yeah, this leads to, if you like, a long-term positional struggle where white has the better chances because white's so much ahead in development. So if we follow the game, Berksis rated 2521 and Dana rated 2440 in Hungary 2010. We see black tried to free up the position with pawn to b6, trying to develop the bishop and queen side, but white continued bishop to f3. But after bishop to f3, rook had to move to b8, knight to e2. Note this knight's coming to c3 or f4 to d5 to control some important squares. Black tried bishop to b7 just to try and free up some pieces, but after bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, knight to c3, we already see that white has the much better position. In the game, black tried king to d8, trying to come off this open file, because rook h to e1 was threatened. But after king to d8 and knight to d5, white's advantage was unquestionable, even despite being a pawn down. Bishop to e7 to try and develop the bishop, but now rook h to e1 threatened to win the bishop. Black was forced to go rook to e8 to defend the bishop, but after rook to d3, threatening again to play rook to e3, winning the bishop. Bishop f8 happened, rook takes e8 check, king takes e8, rook to c3, king to f7 happened, and now rook to c8. So we already see the complete domination of the board by white's pieces. Not that in this position, even a freeing move like king to e6, rook to f8, king takes e5, rook to f7 would be bad for black because white would regain one of the pawns in a much better position. Okay, so going back to the position after rook to c8, f5 was tried by black in this game, and then white just continued king to d2. It's just worth noting here, if white were to have maybe a king on a6, that rook is gone. And we kind of see that plan in the game after the next few moves. So g6, because black's just shuffling pieces. King to d3. Just watch. There is a threat of this king coming all the way to a6, h5, a4. And note in this position, even b5 would be met by something like pawn to a5, threatening pawn to a6 next. So yeah, just going back to that position. So after h5, a4, black tried bishop to h6, and now rook to a8. Yeah, this just stopped the pawn from going to a6. Here, black, oblivious to this threat of king coming to a6, played bishop to c1, and after b3 played g5. But then now we see king to c4. And now it became obvious where this king was heading. So black tried pawn to a6 to stop the king infiltrating on b5. But then after rook takes a6 and rook to b8, it was now white who was a pawn ahead in a much better position. White went on to win this in another couple of moves. So just to recap, if we go back to the starting position in the Staunton Gambit, and in the main line after queen to e2, we see that the main line, knight to f7, bishop f6, e takes f6, knight takes e4, gives white some very good positional advantage. The point being that bishop to e7 will be met by this nice positional sacrifice with pawn to d6. And even if we take that back, bishop to b4 check and c3 first, would still allow white to gain an advantage after this positional sacrifice. Going back a couple of moves as well, and the main line queen to e7 will also be met by pawn to d6, when white would have good positional compensation and a more promising game. So yeah, this brings us to the end of our two-part series on the Staunton Gambit against the Dutch defense. I hope you enjoyed this, and please don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hope to see you on the next one.